Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dalaran, and in today's video I decided to do a little bit of research. Have you ever wondered what is the most popular, or better yet, least popular covenant of every single class right now? I decided to look into it to find out which covenants are looking the least popular because I've always loved the underdog playstyle. Quite a lot of you guys in 5.5.1 duels joined and been playing some really interesting and even weird covenants, and I've been a huge fan of that because it inspires me, as well as probably others, to try something new and different and try to kind of make their own ground. Well, let's take a look at which covenants are least picked by players, and we can assess some of the ways you might be able to use those covenants, but also some of the ways where they do fall flat in case Blizzard does any kind of covenant tunings in the future. So let's take a look at the least favorite covenants, or the most underdog covenants available for every single class, mostly for PvE content right now. First class we're going to dive into is going to be the Warrior, and their most underdog covenant is going to be the Necrolord. At some point during Alpha and Beta, everybody were planning of having a Warrior with Conqueror's Banner, until Blizzard has done a lot of reworks in order to make the covenants a lot closer. Right now, Conqueror's Banner is a 3-minute cooldown that plants a banner on the ground, granting you and a couple allies extra critical strike as well as extra health. Also, while spending rage while the banner is up earns you glory, which gives you even more critical strike. The banner on its own is really not bad, and actually has some. The second ability the warriors will get with Necrolord is Fleshcraft, 2 minutes in order to be able to give yourself a shield. The shield will also consume any corpses around you to amplify the shield even further. Two good abilities that should come with a covenant that should be pretty decent, but do they really work out all that well? Fleshcraft isn't a bad ability, and a variety of classes still use it right now, before a pull or during transition when they can't reach the boss. But as a tank, you wouldn't use this ability. Even though you think you should, you wouldn't use it mid-combat because during this ability you actually can't dodge the enemy attacks, or parry or block. So it does have some limitations, which might be one of the reasons why warriors don't pick up this covenant. While the banner itself doesn't really have much play, it in fact does have some great and powerful uses. If you end up going Necrolord as a warrior, you could pick up the Veteran's Respute Soulbind that does give you extra strength while the banner is active, making it a very powerful cooldown for all the different CDs you're combining for your Fury, Arms Warrior, or even Protection. The banner on its own isn't really even a terrible ability since it is group utility. Not only does it give you critical strike, but also to your allies, as well as extra health, which can go a long way in terms of Mythic Plus dungeons for survivability. But there's also extra benefits if you pair this together with a Soulbind from Emily, Soulbind name being Lead by Example. Because of this ability being a 3-minute cooldown, you'll get the most value possible in terms of the duration from Lead by Example, which I would think could be amazing for small group content, or maybe buffing certain classes within certain groups in raids. While this is definitely not a popular choice by many players, I feel like there's maybe some potential to it. And if you're someone who wants to make the Warrior Necrolord work, I feel like there are enough combos in order to give your allies a little bit more amplitude. Warriors themselves don't really deal that much damage to begin with anyway, so buffing the damage of your allies doesn't seem like the worst idea to me. The next combo that dropped in popularity we'll talk about is Death Knight and Death's Due. At some point, every one of you Death Knights was going to be a pretty little fairy playing for the Night Fae, but after Blizzard has made some changes, they made Death's Due a lot weaker. Death's Due replaces your Death and Decay, giving it a blue look, but also it amplifies certain abilities. While using abilities that cost runes inside of Death's Due gives you extra strength and provides a bunch of bonuses for a bunch of different specs. For Blood Decay, it means very easy cleave, with also short CD on your Death and Decay means pretty good uptime. For your Unholy, same thing, with its natural cleave combined already, and in some cases you actually drop Death and Decay as a single target anyway. For Frost, it offers opportunity for Death's Due or Death and Decay modification to actually become usable in single target as well as the cleaves, as for Frost Death Knight it actually allows Obliterate heavy playstyles to also cleave a secondary target, which actually gives it an extra use. It was a very popular choice in the beta up until Blizzard did a lot of tuning. For a class as slow as Death Knight, the ability of Soul Shape was a godsend, as it allowed you a momentary blink as well as movement speed until you engaged in combat again. This ability is great for quick repositionals, or if you're trying to cross distance from one place to another, and for a class with lacking mobility, Death Knights always found this ability kind of useful, but with Death's Due dropping out of the meta, it became a lot harder for most players to justify it. But it won't stop us from exploring how good Death's Due potentially could be for Death Knights if they choose to pick it up. First of all, if you're playing as a Blood Death Knight, it gives you an ability that gives you quite a bit of strength on a very short cooldown, and with how often your Death and Decay resets, it's basically constantly up. For Frost Death Knights, it gives you the ability for your Obliterate to cleave an extra target, which is very niche but also unique in terms of allowing your Frost Death Knights to run together with Cultura's favorite legendary for extra Obliterate damage, and since it cleaves, in any target situation where there's more than 2 enemies you're hitting, plus with the Obliterate heavy playstyle that some Death Knights have picked up, it actually gives you quite a big bursty situation for anything where there's more than one target involved. Plus, the strength from this ability also feeds into the playstyle that Frost Death Knight has, beefing you up full of strength and bursting enemies down. And Unholy Death Knights in particular have a Defile plus Death Certainty legendary combo that allows Death and Decay or Death's Due to almost always be constantly up. So you always, for the full duration of the fight, maintain massive amounts of extra strength in order to beef up your armies of undead and do extra damage. So while not all Death Knights found this covenant super popular, there definitely are some uses and combos that work with it. Some covenants don't really have any legendary combos, but for Death Knights and Death's Due Nightfate Covenant, there's actually quite a few combos to use, especially if you're a DPS, and I would say this covenant is far from terrible, even in this current moment, but I wonder if any buffs will come in the future. Next we have Demon Hunters, and their least popular covenant ability seems to be the Necrolord kind, Fodder to the Flame, which on a 2-minute cooldown calls forth a demon to fight you. Upon defeating the demon, you gain an empowered demon soul. It's kind of like an old thing Demon Hunters used to do a lot more in Legion, but in recent expansions a lot less of. When they slay a demon and consume a demon soul, they actually deal damage. Extra damage, in fact. An empowered demon soul lets them do 30% extra damage and take 15% less damage. On a fairly short 2-minute cooldown for a 20-second duration, this would seem pretty good. Even Blizzard Throne and stuff like Throwglaive does a lot more damage to this guy, so he can be cleaved down and defeated very, very easily. But this ability hasn't really been all too popular. Some Demon Hunters found it a little bit weird, especially as a class so mobile. Using the ability of Fleshcraft sometimes can make you think, wait, do I actually want to use this? If I have so much mobility, I can either stand there and channel a shield or maybe just walk away. However, the Fleshcraft shield is generally a good one and can be comboed with other Covenant Soulbind choices. Fodder to the Flame as an ability though is a little bit weirder to use, and Demon Hunters found it kind of awkward because, well, you're summoning an extra enemy to hit you and to defeat it very quickly. I think for Demon Hunters there's actually some potential summoning this guy early, being able to build up a lot of resources, using Fodder to the Flame and getting the buff, and then going into full Metamorphosis drop. I feel that maybe there's going to be more Demon Hunters that could give this ability a go, as there's always been some great potential to it, but it just hasn't been as easy to use as the other abilities. So I wonder if there's any brave demon hunting soul out there that's willing to play around with Fodder to the Flame in the near future. Next we have the Druids, and for Druids their least popular covenant ended up being, at least so far, the Venthyr Covenant. The Venthyr Covenant is actually quite a powerful one. Ravenous Frenzy is kind of like an incarnation style buff. For 20 seconds, every Druid ability you cast will increase your damage, healing, and haste with extra percentiles. So every single time you press an ability, you grow stronger and stronger and stronger. However, if you end up staying idle, you will end up stunning yourself and doing damage to yourself, which in combat situations shouldn't happen too often, and there's quite a lot of abilities that are non-combat related that will keep a Druid in this form. Getting CC'd by enemies, or let's say dungeon or boss mechanics, does not force a stun on you, as Blizzard decided to clean up this ability as much as possible. The second ability of the Venthyr Covenant is Door of Shadows, my favorite ability that lets you kind of teleport to a location. Very similar to a Heroic Leap, minus the leaping, but more of this misty red teleportation. It's a really cool ability, and even as class, as mobile as Druid, will never generally say no to even more mobility. Mobility plus extra mobility just makes you even stronger. Why does doing more damage and more healing with this ability end up being not a very popular choice amongst Druids? Well, in fact, Ravenous Frenzy from the Venthyr is actually not a terrible ability at all. A lot of Druids just kind of find it maybe boring, as it's just a buff that overlaps your other abilities. But it is insanely strong, and no Druids deny it. Actually, combined together with the actual conduit for this ability, extra crits for every single class, that's more healing or more damage. Both of the Balanced Druid legendaries for AoE or single target synergize into it exceptionally well. And Guardian Druids in particular can actually be complete monsters with the Venthyr Covenant and a couple combos, whether from legendaries or even conduits. I do wonder if maybe in the future we'll have more Druids trying this Covenant. It actually doesn't seem all that bad, and most of the drawbacks of hurting yourself and stunning yourself seem to have been alleviated back from the beta and the alpha, but I wonder if we'll ever see anybody giving this a very solid go. When it comes to Hunters, we have the Maldraxxan Covenant being the least popular, with Death Chakram as the ability, which is the only ability out of all the other Covenant abilities that even plays with your focus regeneration. Focus regen is always wanted by Hunters, no matter whether you're Marksman, Beastmaster, or Survival, but it just never really seemed to have picked up as an ability. The ability to shield yourself does make the sometimes squishy Hunter a lot more durable and does have some uses with certain soul binds, and is never really a bad ability to add towards the Hunter toolkit. Is this Covenant ability really all that bad? The answer I think is no, but does it really fit the current mold and the metas created right now? I think most of the metas are reliant around Marksman and around your burst damage, so Night Fae and the Kyrian just end up fitting it really well. Some of the positives of Death Chakram is the fact that it doesn't change any Hunter playstyle at all. It is very a non-invasive ability that can be baked into any specs rotation quite easily. Some of the abilities have very specific legendaries that they combo with really well, which makes for a very, I would say, rigid build structure. But with this ability, there's a lot more freedom in how you decide to run yourself and customize your character. It's one of those abilities that's very easy to use on the move and has a lot of that single target potential with some play for AoE. In comparison to the Kyrian and the Night Fae, where enemies have to stand in one specific area to deal the most damage, Death Chakram does implore a lot more mobility for a class like a Hunter. So whether you Survival, Beastmastery, or Marksman on the move, throwing out a Death Chakram does generate quite a bit of damage and even resources, which does give it that unique factor. For monks, their least popular covenant ended up being the Venthyr Covenant. The ability of Fallen Order allows you to open a portal for 24 seconds, allowing spirits of fallen monks of the Ox, Crane, and Tiger adepts to join you in battle, either healing, tanking for you, or doing damage. The teleport of Door of Shadows, as we talked about before, for a class as mobile as Monk, again, not the worst thing ever. Having more mobility on an already mobile class is almost never a terrible thing. Being able to have more ways to get around the battlefield, dungeons, or raids, or even skip certain trash packs with mythic pluses, again, never really a bad thing. The ability itself of Fallen Order is actually extremely easy to use. You just drop it down and all these NPCs roll up and start helping you out. The ability itself just doesn't have, I think, that niche factor, and it's never really been focused for one spec or another, as the monks that join in are helpful no matter what spec you are. I wonder, as more monks go forward and looking for extra cooldowns to use in dungeons, raids, maybe even some PvP situations, might end up picking up Fallen Order. The extra mobility and the ease of use would actually be a really good selling factor, unless these monks just simply don't have the throughput, which could be its biggest downfall. For mages, their least popular covenant ends up being the Necrolord Covenant. The Necrolord Covenant offers the mage Deathborn ability, which transforms him into a powerful skeleton mage for 20 seconds, where your Fireball, Frostbolt, and Arcane Blast hit up to 2 nearby enemies, and those spells do 10% more damage. Mages actually are kind of squishy, so ability of Fleshcraft actually offers them extra protection every 2 minutes. Again, as a DPS, you would end up using it before a fight, usually not in the middle of a fight, especially as a ranged, because you can always reach the boss with even intermissions, but it does still have uses. This ability is really not terrible unless maybe you're fire, because you don't really fireball that much, or fireball isn't a good portion of your damage. However, if this was for some reason for your Pyroblast, I think a lot more mages would consider it, but for fire, this does come at an actual lower value. For Frost, this is actually somewhat useful, with the legendary of Silk Ice, where you will be using Frostbolt quite a lot during your rotation, so buffing that Frostbolt, making it cleave multiple enemies, and doing more damage just seems like a no-brainer. And for Arcane, Arcane Blast is kind of your bread and butter ability, so making that do more damage and even cleave could actually be really strong together. Plus, that is a powerful 3-minute cooldown, so lead by example from Emily, Soulbind actually offers the group quite a bit of extra stats for quite a long time. At some point, this was actually a very strong Covenant ability for Arcane in particular, and kind of just fell off right as the beta was ending. I wonder if Blizzard could maybe shorten the cooldown of this ability to be used a lot more often, or maybe even remove the cast time or make it off GCD to make it a lot more friendlier to use. Maybe even adjust it for Fire Mage to work with Pyroblast instead, and I wonder if that could be enough to get more mages to try the Necrolord Covenant more. When it comes to Shadow Priest, for all 3 specs, the Nightfey Covenant ability ends up being the least popular. The ability every priest gets with the Nightfey is called Fey Guardians. On a 1.5 minute cooldown, it calls forth 3 fairies to help you in combat. Wrathful Fairy will mark an enemy, where subsequent attacks against the enemy will restore your allies' resources. Guardian Fairy, which will be used with next power word shield, so you can shield a tank for example, and will reduce that tank's damage taken by 10%. For Shadow Priest, you automatically gain the Guardian Fairy when you use this ability. You also get to put up a Benevolent Fairy on an ally, which follows whoever you flash heal or Shadowman as a priest. For Shadow Priest again, this one automatically applies to you, which increases the cooldown recovery rate of a major ability by 100%. We mentioned earlier for the Death Knights, but also for the Priests, Soul Shape as an ability for a class as immobile as Priests are actually gives you quite a lot of repositional value. Never underestimate mobility in just about every PvE or PvP situation. So why hasn't this Covenant taken off? It seems like a decent Covenant, particularly for group gameplay, if you're trying to support your allies, and I think that's really the biggest drawback from this Covenant. It used to be insanely strong, giving the priest a lot of the value, but now it seems to be more of a group-oriented playstyle. If your group doesn't do that much damage or isn't really doing well, the Night Fae ability won't really make you do well. This only amplifies an already good existing group. So I guess other Covenant abilities could be used instead in order to make you shine brighter as a Disc, Holy, or a Shadow Priest. Fey Guardians on their own is really not that bad of an ability, very short cooldown and is instant cast, so you can be weaved into rotation very easily and does provide support value, but a lot of players don't really like the support playstyle. A lot of players would rather see those numbers rise, and when you have Covenants as strong as, let's say, the Venthyr Covenant with the damage of the Mind Games that can be used by healers as well as DPS, well, you have yourself a very interesting combo that's very difficult to beat. I feel like the Nightfey Covenant itself could maybe use some buffs, maybe something to make the priest do more. I like this support utility playstyle, but the Wrathful Fairy I feel like kind of under-delivers, and I could totally see Blizzard giving some kind of buffs in that regard. Maybe somewhere with the Wrathful Fairy allowing you to somehow do extra healing or extra damage, or better yet, just summon an NPC fairy that will do damage or healing for you, or try to replicate a damage of a certain spell, but just at a lower value. Just anything like that would just sound really cool. But I don't think the Nightfey Covenant itself for Priest is really all that bad, but I do think it will just make your group stronger, but group play isn't always on every player's mind. So a lot of players have found it difficult to justify Fey Guardians, and I wonder if we'll see any priests in Mythic Pluses, raids, or even PvP trying to utilize Fey Guardians to the full context, especially when it comes to the CDR for your healers in order to make their lives easier in Mythic Pluses, provide an extra 10% damage reduction for your tanks, and even allowing your party members and healers to gain extra resources within, let's say, tough raid fights or such. The least popular Covenant for Paladins ended up being the Necrolord, with the ability of Vanquisher's Hammer. Vanquisher's Hammer is an ability where you throw a hammer at the target and you empower a certain combo of your abilities. For Retribution, your next Templar's Verdict will trigger a Divine Storm. For Holy, next Word of Glory will also apply Light of Dawn. And for Protection, Word of Glory will also give you a free Shield of the Righteous. So you kind of get an extra AoE ability, or in terms of the tank, a defensive with your heal. The extra shielding from Fleshcraft as a Paladin I never felt was a bad combo. Paladins generally lack in mobility, but extra shielding can also help you deal with that lack of mobility. Just add extra absorb and take it to the face, especially if you just can't run out of things. The one advantage of the Vanquisher's Hammer, even though it's not popular, is it's really easy to use and should be basically pressed on cooldown, and it allows Paladins to actually have some very interesting combos. If you play Retribution for PvE, however, you get Tempest of the Lightbringer as you're probably the go-to legendary. So Vanquisher's Hammer gives you a free Divine Storm, which is buffed with the legendary. So this gives you actually quite a value on the ability, especially if you're not getting those Divine Storm procs, even in pure single target. If you are a Holy Paladin running Shadowbreaker Dawn of the Sun legendary, Light's Dawn bonus effect actually does get to trigger from Vanquisher's Hammer. The only spec that's kind of left out without any combos is Protection, but for Protection this actually ends up being your best single target damage and ability. It has a very short cooldown and ends up doing quite a bit of your damage. Vanquisher's Hammer is actually a very easy ability to use, with some very niche and unique combos, and I wonder if more Paladins in the future will even consider taking a look at Vanquisher's Hammer and the potential combos they may have. For Shamans, their least popular covenant ended up being the Night Fae, with the Fae Transfusion ability, 2-minute cooldown of Channeling. Yes, you heard me right. You channel in an AoE area, doing spell power damage to enemies over 3 seconds, and after pressing Fae Transfusion ability again, you'll actually release this healing ability based on the damage you've done. This ability has a cap of 4 enemies, but it will do the same amount of damage to them, whether it's single target or whether it is 4, so it actually has some single target capability. For enhancement in particular, it will also generate you 3 stacks of Maelstrom, so that's the time when you could have been swinging your weapon, at least you gain some sort of a value. For a class as mobile as a Shaman with the Ghost Wolf, Soul Shape ends up being still not a terrible ability. During Ghost Wolf, you can't really damage the enemy, you have to go into Ghost Wolf and move. With Soul Shape, you're able to faster reposition, plus more mobility never hurt anybody. The Night Fae ability for Shamans actually doesn't have too much of a complex value change in terms of playing Resto or Elemental. It just adds on extra damage on the 2-minute cooldown, and it won't change your playstyle whatsoever. However, not a lot of Shamans have picked it up so far. Although, from what I've seen, it's not the worst ability ever. The one drawback to it would be the fact that it locks you in place. Maybe if more Shamans could move while casting this ability in an AoE area, or maybe to a target and any enemies near them, might make it a little bit easier to use. As enhancement, you can actually combine this ability together with the talent of Earthen Spike, which will make the enemy take extra physical and nature damage. Fae Transfusion is all nature damage, so it actually ends up kind of combining together pretty well, in case that it might be something of your interest as an enhancement Shaman. Otherwise, this ability, like very much other Shaman abilities, doesn't really change your gameplay drastically. It just gives you an extra button to use from time to time, although compared to the other extra buttons, this would just have had the least amount of popularity. I wonder if there are some, again, movement-based things that Blizzard could do in order to inspire more Shamans to give Night Fae Covenant a go, because there are some really good soulbinds to go with it that would fit Shaman pretty well. When it comes to rogues, the least popular covenant is going to end up being the Necrolord Covenant, which offers them the ability of Serrated Bone Spike on a 30-second recharge with 3 charges costing only measly 15 energy. You embed a Bone Spike into the enemy, dealing a little bit of attack power, putting a perma bleed on the enemy where they will bleed the bleed every 3 seconds until they die. You also get a recharge of the Bone Spike if the enemy with the spike dies. You also get 1 combo point per active Bone Spike, so if you throw out a Bone Spike, it stabs an enemy, that's 1 combo point. If you already have 2 Bone Spikes on 2 enemies and you throw another one out, that one will generate 3 combo points. And you actually could have a bunch of bleeds available where every single Bone Spike you throw out gives you full bar of combo points, which I think is the caveat for this ability. As a rogue main, we are pretty squishy, let me tell you, and Flashcraft ends up actually being a decent choice for rogues. It will allow you to maybe get a reset, sap on an enemy, get yourself a Flashcraft, and get back into combat. But in PvE, it'll be used like other DPS classes, before combat or during intermissions. For all 3 specs, this doesn't really seem like the most influential ability, and it's actually really easy to use. The bleed is kind of nice even though low, but it is permanently on the enemy for the whole fight as long as they don't top off to 100% health. The extra combo points you can generate with this ability, especially in cleave specific situations, can also be a very powerful combo. In fact, all the covenants for rogues I know for certain are literally within 2% of each other in terms of sims, basically no matter which spec you end up playing. But a lot of the community found themselves kind of drawn away from the Serrated Bone Spike for one reason or another. I think it really comes down to maybe the utility that the other covenants bring in terms of the secondary abilities, as a lot of the primary abilities are fairly low impact for the most part. I have even seen a lot more subtlety rogues with Serrated Bone Spike in particular. The extra combo points it provides for them for the big finishers can actually be huge. So I do wonder if we'll maybe see a resurgence of Serrated Bone Spike in the future, especially as we can get better conduits for it that increase the damage of it even further. Finally, for Warlocks, we have ourselves the least popular covenant being the Venthyr Covenant. Impending Catastrophe is an ability that sends out a cloud of chaotic anima that will pass through every single enemy, putting damage over time on them, hitting the final enemy with a massive explosion that will also curse enemies. This ability, I've been told, will try to curse with weakness enemies that are primarily melee and curse of tongues enemies that are primarily casters, allegedly. For Warlocks, which is a pretty immobile class, Door of Shadows actually looks like a solid choice for instant or near instant mobility. It does have a short cast time, but being able to reposition yourself fairly quickly as a Warlock, besides your teleport and your gateway, extra mobility never hurts anyone. This ability hasn't been super popular, even though it actually has some uses. It has a potential for single target, but also some capability for AoE. As long as you're able to kind of position yourselves properly, then you'll be able to have this ability bypass through a bunch of enemies, cursing them, but also putting up a debuff. This debuff is a damage over time, which actually does combine to all the other specs and classes that benefit from dots, like Affliction Warlocks and the Malefic Rapture spams. This ability does offer you an extra damage over time ability to work with. And for every other specs, it also is an ability that's very easy to use as long as you keep it on cooldown. It does have a minute CD, but it lines up with your CDs very easily. But to my surprise, not a lot of Warlocks found this ability usable. I've always thought this ability's animation was sick. I really did enjoy it for the longest time playing Alpha and the Beta. With Warlocks being a very immobile class, I always thought the Venthyr Covenant would fit them very well, but it seems that a lot of other players decided, you know what, the Night Phase seems to do a bit more damage, at least in the early sims, and it also has mobility capabilities, maybe even better in certain situations. It's hard to tell what's really holding this Covenant back for a lot of Warlock players. Maybe it's the soulbinds, maybe it is the actual Covenant abilities, maybe it's the conduits for those Covenant abilities. But I wonder maybe if this is something numerical that Blizzard will have to probably do in the future, as not a lot of people are just playing Venthyr at all. And I can't think of a way where you could actually make this ability better or stronger, or maybe even as close to meta for more players. While this is a long video, I'm actually very glad I made it, because it was really cool to research all the different covenants that are strong or not strong for a variety of different classes. One thing I found out doing this is that Necrolord Covenant for a lot of specs and classes is actually the least popular choice. I mean, just count single-handedly just how many times we've mentioned Necrolord in this video. I even tried to space it out in order to not have Necrolord follow each other back to back to back. But it is very interesting, and I wonder if we'll see any buffs in the future. Blizzard is very skittish about doing buffs and nerfs to any of the Covenant stuff right now. They're really skittish about making players regret their choices. Imagine going for a Covenant you think is going to be the strongest, and then another Covenant gets buffed. Now you feel like you have to swap from one Covenant to another. I wonder if there's some kind of line Blizzard can walk that will buff Covenants that are looking less popular, not enough to make them stronger than the most popular ones, but enough to make the players that chose the least popular Covenants at least make a little bit extra amends in terms of damage or effectiveness or any other output. I wonder if that is something they may solve in the future, because I think it'll be really cool. There's a lot of different playstyles, and players like their Covenants. Some of them play them because they enjoy the playstyle, the transmogs or whatever, and a lot of them are very close to each other. But I wonder if there's something Blizzard can do in order to facilitate the ability for those players to enjoy them more, or at least be more effective with those Covenants, as the meta is still going to be the name of the beast. Thank you all so much for watching. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. Let me know what you think about these findings and this research. What do you think about this video and everything we got going on? Thank you all so much for watching. Hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see all of you guys in another video.